what the government has in mind long term, the fight during the late 1990s, that it wants direct, if not control, at least direct say in how NGOs govern themselves.
New legislation before Parliament could threaten to undermine the independence and the autonomy of non-profit organizations. Joining me to discuss is Martin van Staden. He is the Deputy Head of Policy Research at the Institute of Race Relations. So Martin, you at the IRR have been quite concerned about this legislative amendment to the non-profits legislation. Could you tell us the background to this and what are some of your concerns exactly?
Yeah, definitely. So the Treasury in late September published this general laws anti-money laundering and combating terrorism finance amendment bill, much to little fanfare, in fact. This is an omnibus amendment bill, meaning it amends 5 separate pieces of legislation, including the Non-Profit Organizations Act of 1997, which regulates NPOs like the IRR, like civil society organizations, charities, and so forth. This really did come as a surprise, mostly because the comment period was only around 10 or 11 calendar days and barely a week of working days. So the Institute was very concerned about this because the Institute has fought this battle before when the original NPO Act was adopted in 1997. The government clearly wanted at that time to appoint board members at NPOs, and the Institute at that time said that this is a no-go. Because civil society organizations like NPOs have to be independent of political interference. So we're very aware and awake to attempted amendments of this legislation, which in this case was buried inside this omnibus amendment bill. So we registered our concern. The government's official reason for this apparent rush is to avoid greylisting by international entities. But this is unacceptable. You don't let go of a fundamental pillar of constitutional democracy, like the independence of civil society, just because government has over the last 2 decades failed to comply with the standards that could avoid greylisting. So the Institute is very concerned about where this is going, and thankfully now the committee in Parliament has agreed to an extension of the public commentary period until the 25th of October. That's still quite short. It's not ideal. Usually a comment period is about a month. We asked for 2 additional months, but it's certainly better than what we got initially.
All right. Well, Martin, this is, I think, speaking to some of the tendencies of the ANC government. Very much command and control philosophy, centralizing. We've spoken often on the show about the National Democratic Revolution, which is part of the, I guess, philosophical foundations of the organization. So there's generally quite an antipathy towards civil society organizations. If you look back in 2016 under the Zuma administration, the then Minister of Intelligence, David Mahlobo, alluded to the fact that he thought NGOs were a front for regime change agents. So, I think that speaks to the sense of paranoia with regards to NGOs and the perception by the government. Yeah. What are the specific concerns that you have with this legislation, and what are you proposing instead?
Yeah, so civil society is always an alternative center of power to the government. And like I said, we saw this in the late 90s. The government wanted to have a very clear say in how individual NGOs governed themselves. Very recently, also, Minister Aaron Motsoaledi, Minister of Home Affairs, has been very radical in his statements against the Helen Suzman Foundation in particular. The government does not like having a competing center of power, especially NPOs that really play this role of keeping government accountable, often litigating against government. It's always an annoyance So what the 1997 NPO legislation provided for was that NPOs did not have to register with government. The act very clearly said that they could register and that they were encouraged to comply with certain standards set in the act. Now, that changes if this amendment bill is adopted. It will become compulsory for NGOs to register with the government. And then it will also become compulsory for NGOs to start complying with the standards as they're currently set in the Act. Now, that the Act currently is written quite benignly. And even if you look at the specific wording of the amendment, nothing radical new is being brought in. However, the issue here is that this is the thin edge of the wedge, because the Institute has already seen what the government has in mind long term, the fight during the late 1990s, that it wants direct, if not control, at least direct say in how NGOs govern themselves. As you alluded to, the government is very paranoid about whether NGOs are in fact actors for foreign governments in South Africa. So you can see that the South African government has a long-term vision in mind here to bring NGOs and NPOs to heel. Now, whether that's to safeguard South Africa's sovereignty, that's probably a nice story that will eventually be spun. But in fact, at the end of the day, it's going to be to keep NPOs from keeping government accountable, from investigating corruption in government, from ensuring that violations of civil liberties and constitutional rights that we see in legislation like the expropriation bill goes completely unaddressed by civil society. That is what I believe is government's long-term goal here. So in principle, we need to defeat this idea that NPOs have to register with government and that they have to comply with government edicts. The reality is that government must not provide oversight for NPOs. It's NPOs that provide oversight over government. So that is the principled fight that we have on our hands here. And it's a very important fight because we know more or less what is coming in the future if this amendment bill is adopted.
And what are you arguing for in terms of an alternative approach to these legislative amendments, bearing in mind, obviously, that we do need to comply with the FATF international regulations around money laundering and terrorism financing?
Well, it's already illegal according to common law and existing legislation in South Africa that one cannot fund terrorism, and money laundering is a common law offense. So that law already exists. The Institute was instrumental in the design of the current NPO Act, and we would like that to remain as it is. NPOs must not be required to register. They must, of course, as they are, be bound by common law standards and by existing anti-terrorism legislation, of which South Africa has FICA and the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorism and Related Activities Act. All this legislation already exists, and the Institute would very much like to see that the very liberal and free NPO space remains liberal and remains free, so that NPOs can continue to play the crucial role that they have been playing here in South Africa, which NPOs elsewhere in Africa have never had the chance to do. We have to jealously guard the independence of our civil society.
Martin van Staden, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. What do you think are government's intentions by requiring non-profit organizations to register with the state? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section. Also, if you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this video over here. Don't forget to hit that like button and also subscribe to the channel. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.